The autumn had not arrived gently that year. It came, as cruelty often does, without announcement, a sudden dropping of temperature in the space of a single night, a grey lid pressed down over the city, as though the sky had simply decided it was finished with warmth, and rain that fell not in sheets, but in a fine, punishing mist that soaked through wool and pride with equal indifference. Ilara Voss stood at the edge of the Whitmore family's front steps, precisely where she had been told to stand, and she did not move. She had learned, in the 3 years since her father's shipping company had collapsed under the weight of bad debts and worse luck, that stillness was its own armor. To move without direction was to invite commentary. To fidget was to betray anxiety, and anxiety was a weakness the Whitmore household collected and catalogued with the same thoroughness that Mrs. Whitmore applied to her silver. To remain perfectly still was to be merely furniture, and furniture at least was not mocked to its face. She had rehearsed this posture so many times over 3 years that it had become reflex rather than choice. The spine straight, the chin level, the hands quiet at her sides, the expression arranged into the neutral patience of a woman who is simply waiting and does not mind the wait. She had found, as the months of the arrangement accumulated, that this posture was also a kind of protection. It was very difficult to wound a woman who gave nothing away. The Whitmore house rose behind her, 4 stories of pale stone and polished windows, every curtain drawn just so, every surface testifying to the kind of wealth that had never known a single uncertain quarter. It was the kind of house that had not merely survived generations, but had thickened through them, layer upon layer of inheritance and advantage, and the quiet, unacknowledged weight of a family that had always had enough and could not conceive of the arithmetic of want. She did not belong on these steps. She had never been invited to stand on them in any sense that mattered. She had been directed here by Mrs. Whitmore herself, in that particular tone the woman reserved for household staff and Ilara both, the tone that managed to be entirely civil and precisely demeaning in the same breath, and informed that someone would need to manage the front door and attend to the luggage before the family descended for the consulate reception. The family would not wait in the rain. The family did not wait in rain. That was the kind of thing other people did. Ilara would do it. She was, after all, simply Damien Whitmore's fiancé in name. The quiet arrangement concluded 3 months prior by 2 sets of desperate lawyers and 1 very practical engagement notice buried in the back pages of the society column, where announcements went to be seen without being celebrated. She was not, in the estimation of the Whitmore household, a person of consequence. She was a transaction that had been completed and could now be stored. She turned up her collar against the mist. The rain continued, fine and indifferent, settling into the folds of her dark coat, into the small hairs at her temples, into the hollow at the base of her throat. She watched the street and kept her spine straight, and did not allow herself to think about what she looked like, standing alone in the grey while the lit windows of the house behind her glowed with warmth she had not been invited to share, because she had found that this particular category of thought served no purpose and no one, least of all herself. There were things she could not change tonight, and the weather was among them, and she had long ago made a discipline of not spending energy on the immovable. She had survived considerably worse framings than this one, and more humiliating ones too. The evening was still ahead of her, and she intended to arrive at it with everything that was worth arriving with still intact. The cold did not bother her in any way she was willing to acknowledge. She had been cold before, in rooms as well as in weather, in conversations as well as in corridors, and she had survived each instance by the same method, by reminding herself that cold was temporary and character was not. She thought of her father's face, the way he had looked not broken but resolved, the way he had said to her, "Whatever we lose, we do not lose ourselves." She had kept this. It was worth more than anything she had surrendered. Inside the house, she knew Damien's sister Celestine was completing the last adjustments to an evening gown that had cost more than Ilara's monthly allowance, and would be discussed in at least 3 separate drawing rooms before the week was finished. Celestine Whitmore was the sort of beauty that stopped conversations in rooms, not rudely, not intrusively, but with the easy authority of a thing that commands attention simply by existing in a space. She was tall and dark-eyed, with a laugh that carried precisely the right distance, and a figure that gown-makers wept to dress, and other women studied with the particular attention that is not quite envy and not quite admiration, but occupies the charged space exactly between the two. She was also the sort of beauty that stepped over threshold mud puddles on her way out, and left the wiping of boots entirely to others, without any apparent awareness that the others might notice or mind. Ilara had watched her do this on multiple occasions, and had never once seen any acknowledgement of it cross Celestine's face. This was not unkindness in the ordinary sense. It was a more fundamental failure of imagination, the incapacity to apprehend that the people around her had interior lives of equivalent weight to her own. Ilara had watched over 3 months of increasingly strained Tuesday dinners and stiff weekend visits conducted in rooms that had never warmed to her, a great many things that the Whitmore family assumed she was either too inconsequential to observe or too grateful to mention. She mentioned nothing. She observed everything. She had always been this way, and she had come to understand it not as a limitation, but as a form of quiet power. The power that belongs to the person in any room who is watching while everyone else is performing. She had cultivated this capacity through necessity, and discovered over time that it was the most durable thing she owned. The engagement to Damien had not been her choosing in any sense that could be called romantic. Her mother's solicitor had presented it with the apologetic gravity of a doctor delivering the best available diagnosis from a narrow range of options. Damien Whitmore needed a quiet, uncomplaining wife who would not interfere with his habits or his preferred liberty, and the Voss name, though now hollow as struck bronze, still carried just enough residual weight in the old society registry to be publicly presentable. Ilara had agreed. She had agreed because the alternative was her mother being turned out of the last property they held in Wexham, a house that smelled of her childhood and contained the last of her father's books, the worn desk at which he had worked in the years before everything unravelled. And because she was 26 years old and had made her peace, not without cost, with the understanding that her life was unlikely to contain very much in the way of romantic choosing. She had not, however, agreed to stand in the rain for other people's comfort without at least standing in it with her spine perfectly straight and her expression precisely composed. She was still her father's daughter in this, if in precious little else by now. The mist continued to settle in the small hairs at her temples and bead on the surface of her dark coat. She watched the street, and she waited, maintaining the particular stillness she had perfected. Not the stillness of defeat, but the stillness of a person conserving herself for whatever came next, keeping the best of what she had intact and unhanded until someone proved themselves worthy of the cost of it. She had been waiting a long time. She was very good at it. She did not intend to stop until she found a reason worth stopping for. She thought of the years before the collapse, the house in its full state, the fires lit in every room, the table set for 12 on ordinary evenings, her father reading to her in the library on winter afternoons when the garden was too cold for walking. She allowed herself to think of these things rarely, and never in company, and never with anything approaching grief, because grief was a luxury that belonged to people who could afford it, and she was not, at present, one of those people. What she could afford was clarity. She had it in abundance. She used it as she used everything she had deliberately. She had not been built for display, and she knew it, and she had stopped mourning this fact sometime in the second year after her father's name had first appeared in the wrong columns of the wrong newspapers. There were worse things to be than clear-eyed. She had found that clarity, properly maintained, was a kind of beauty in its own right, one that did not require good weather or flattering light or the approval of people who had decided before she arrived that she was not worth looking at. What happened next she would later struggle to describe to anyone in a way that did not sound like the kind of story a person invents when she wishes her life had gone differently from what it had. It began as a sound, a low, organized sound, entirely distinct from ordinary street traffic, in the way that a deliberate voice is distinct from ambient noise. It had weight and internal rhythm and a gravitational quality that made the few pedestrians on the far pavement slow their walking and turn before they had consciously registered why. Then the black cars appeared at the far end of the street. Not one car, not a hired line of 3, but a proper motorcade, long and polished and numerous, moving in careful formation with the unhurried deliberateness of things that possess an unquestioned right to occupy the center of any road they choose and have never had occasion to doubt it. They were flying a small flag she recognized only after a moment's stunned delay, after her mind had processed the sight twice, because the first result had seemed too improbable to accept. The Royal Standard. She had seen it in newspapers and in the framed photographs her father had kept in the hallway of the Wexham house, out of some combination of patriotism and the sentiment of a man who believed in institutions even when they were not thinking of him. She recognized it now with certainty, and then stood very still with a different quality of stillness than the one she had been maintaining for the past 20 minutes. Not the performed stillness of self-protection, but the arrested stillness of someone who has encountered something they had not prepared for and has not yet decided what to do about it. The lead car slowed approaching the Whitmore house, and then, with a precision suggesting the driver had been given a very specific address and had followed it without deviation, stopped. Not before the main entrance, with its wide stone stairs and polished brass fittings and the double doors that represented the Whitmore family's public face to the world. The motorcade stopped in front of the narrow side steps, the servants' steps, the rain-wet steps where Ilara stood with her collar turned up and a strand of hair coming unpinned on the left side of her bun. A door opened in the second vehicle. A man stepped out with the easy, unhurried authority of someone for whom rain is simply the prevailing weather, and crowds are simply the world's prevailing condition. He was tall in the particular way that certain men are tall, not merely in measurement, but in the manner of carrying that height, as though the space around him had arranged itself in accommodation. He wore no hat against the rain. His face was structured and still, the jaw set, the expression held in a careful neutral that was itself a form of discipline, and his eyes, which were grey as the November sky pressed low above the street, moved across the scene before him with the focused, unhurried attention of a man who was always, in every setting and on every step, genuinely assessing what was in front of him rather than what he had anticipated finding there. He was Crown Prince Alexander of the House of Valen, and Ilara Voss, standing alone in the fine, cold rain with her coat 4 years out of fashion and her expression as composed as she could keep it, was looking directly at him, because she had nowhere else to look and had decided, in the 2 seconds since the motorcade stopped, that she was not going to be the one who looked at her shoes. This was a small decision, and also not a small one. It was the kind of decision that accumulates its full meaning only in retrospect, when you can see, looking back, that it was the moment from which everything else began. She did not know this yet. She knew only that she was standing in the rain, and he had stopped in front of her steps, and she was not going to look away. She stood there, perfectly composed, while the motorcade settled into its position, and the black-coated figures around the cars arranged themselves with the practiced efficiency of a household used to the mechanics of public arrivals. The street had gone very quiet in the particular way that streets go quiet when something significant has entered them. Not silence exactly, but a held quality of attention, a collective breath drawn and not yet released. She was, she realized, at the center of this stillness. She did what she always did. She stood still, and she observed, and she waited for the scene to declare its own terms. She did not step back. She did not, to her own quiet surprise, look away. She was already standing in the rain on behalf of people who had not troubled themselves to come to the door, and she had very little remaining in the way of dignity to spend on avoidance. So she kept what she had left of it, which was not nothing, which had never been nothing, which was in fact the most durable thing she had ever owned, and she met his eyes. He looked at her for a moment. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. He looked at her in a way that was entirely unlike the way people usually looked at Alara Voss. People usually looked past her, or through her, or at the neutral space approximately 2 inches above her left shoulder, a phenomenon so reliable over 3 years that she had come to think of it almost as a spatial quality, her presence induced in others, like a particular angle of light that the eye slides past without registering. He did none of these things. He looked at her directly and without self-consciousness, as though she were a thing that warranted the full, unhurried consideration of a person's eyes, as though looking were a considered act being performed with intent rather than an accident of proximity. And then something shifted at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, the shape the mouth makes in the instant before a smile forms, the faint and careful almost of one, before he turned to the aide beside him and spoke something low that she could not hear across the distance of the wet steps. The aide, a neat and precise man of perhaps 50, with the bearing of someone who has spent decades in careful service and understands that discretion is its own form of authority, produced a small card from his breast pocket, approached the steps with the measured tread of a man performing an important duty, and said with entirely unironic gravity, "His Royal Highness sends his compliments, Miss Voss, and inquires whether you are being attended to as you ought to be." She understood then, with a clarity that was almost physical in its certainty, 2 things simultaneously. That the royal household had known she would be standing here, on these particular steps, at this particular hour, and that whoever had communicated this information had done so with deliberate purpose rather than accident. She did not yet know why. She knew only that the front door of the Whitmore house was opening behind her at considerable speed, the sound of the motorcade having evidently penetrated even Celestine's dressing room at the topmost floor, and that the Crown Prince of Valen was still watching her across the misted air between them with those winter-grey eyes, and that for the first time in a very long while, longer, perhaps, than she had allowed herself to count, she had been seen by someone who appeared to have been, in some deliberate and purposeful sense, looking for her. The observation did not unsettle her. It steadied her in the way that unexpected solid ground steadies a person who has been walking carefully on uncertain terrain, not quite trusting each step to hold. She was not accustomed to being found. She had, over time, become accustomed to being overlooked, and had organized herself accordingly. She understood now, with a precision that surprised her, that this particular organization might need to be reviewed. She kept her expression composed and her spine straight, and waited, as she had always waited, for the next thing to declare itself. She thought, in the single still second before the front door finished opening behind her, of all the rooms she had stood at the edges of in 3 years, the drawing rooms and dining rooms and reception halls where she had occupied the peripheral position with such thoroughness that she had come to feel it was her native territory, the place she had been born to inhabit. She wondered briefly and without drama whether it was possible to relocate from a territory you had lived in long enough to mistake for yourself. She suspected it was. She suspected, in fact, that it was beginning now, here, on a pair of servant steps in the rain, with a man who was still looking at her, as though the looking were a deliberate act he had chosen, rather than an accident he had wandered into. She had been invisible for long enough that being seen felt like a change in the weather, sudden and physical, and not quite comfortable yet. The way warmth feels foreign to hands that have been cold for a very long time. She did not know what to do with it. She intended to find out. The Whitmore household descended the front steps with a velocity that bore no resemblance whatsoever to the unhurried, composed leisure that ordinarily governed their public exits. Mrs. Whitmore appeared first, her expression rearranged mid-descent into something carefully managed, a studied, practiced surprise, the performance of a woman who has encountered an unexpected social development of the highest significance and is recalibrating with well-trained speed, smoothing the architecture of her face into warmth, while her eyes conducted a rapid and thoroughgoing inventory of every relevant detail of the scene before her. Celestine appeared directly behind, having managed in under 4 minutes not only to descend and present herself, but to acquire, by some mechanism Ilara could not trace, a more spectacular evening wrap and an entirely renewed expression. The particular quality of luminous, artless, startled beauty that she produced in the presence of powerful men with the same natural reflexive efficiency with which other women produced umbrellas in rain. It was not wholly performed. It was the expression of a woman who genuinely believed that her arrival in any significant man's field of vision was the most important development of the scene, and who had never yet been given sufficient evidence to revise this conviction. Damien descended last, looking, as he reliably did, faintly confused and faintly resentful about whatever was organizing itself around him, his habitual relationship to events he had not himself initiated. None of them looked at Ilara as they passed her on the steps. This was entirely consistent with 3 months of established practice. They looked at the motorcade and at the Crown Prince, who had turned toward their approach with the courteous, slightly remote patience of a man who has been standing in rain for longer than the rain and has arrived at equanimity about it. Introductions were conducted on the steps with rapid, graceful efficiency. Mrs. Whitmore's voice had acquired a timbre Ilara had never previously heard from it, something warm and yielding, like wood carefully softened at the joints by a sustained application of heat. Celestine extended her hand with the precise angle of wrist that communicated an expectation of ceremony. The Crown Prince shook it with polite and unhurried brevity, and he was already looking elsewhere. After Mrs. Whitmore had begun directing the family's placement relative to the cars with the swift authority of a woman who has decided to take charge of a situation before someone else does, Prince Alexander turned fully toward Ilara and addressed her directly for the first time. "Miss Voss," he said. His voice was even, carrying precisely as far as necessary. "You are chilled. Please come out of the rain." It was not framed as a question. It was not quite an order. It occupied the considered space between those two things, the calm, unforced certainty of a man who has identified what sensible looks like and expects the world to cooperate with it. She looked at him for one moment. "Thank you," she said, and nothing more. He appeared, briefly but unmistakably, to appreciate the economy of this. She arrived at the consulate reception in the second car of the royal motorcade, because Prince Alexander's aide had simply opened that door and held it with the neutral efficiency of a man performing a clear duty, and there had been no graceful means of refusing without making the refusal itself the event everyone remembered. She wore her dark coat through the entry and checked it at the cloakroom herself, revealing the dress beneath. Deep grey silk, with a narrow silver trim at the collar and cuffs, not fashionable by the current season's measurements, but well made, and well-fitted, and, in its quietness, entirely and uncomplicatedly hers. She was not Celestine. She understood this without distress. She found a position at the edge of the reception room, as she always did at such events, where she could see the whole of it without being its subject, and she settled herself there with the quiet practicality of a woman who has learned that the edges of rooms are often where the most honest things happen. She made her way to the edge of the reception room, and stood as she always stood at such events, where she could see the whole of it without being its subject. And she settled herself there with the calm practicality of a woman who has learned that the edges of rooms are often where the most honest things happen. The center is where performance occurs. The edges are where people forget to perform, where they let the mask slip for the moment they believe no one important is watching. She was always watching. She was watching now, with the quality of attention her father had called the Voss inheritance, not money, not property, both of which had eventually gone away, but the capacity to see things clearly. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. The consulate reception was the kind of evening Elara had attended a dozen times over 3 years and remembered always as the same composite impression. Chandelier light, the smell of cut lilies over old stone, and the near-geometric way people arranged themselves according to rank and connection. She held a glass of water rather than champagne. Champagne gave her a persistent headache, and she had simply stopped pretending otherwise. And she watched the room work through its opening configurations with the attention of someone who finds rooms genuinely interesting. The way people find each other, the way alliances surface in the angle of a body, the way the real business of such evenings is conducted in the 2 inches of space between one person leaning very slightly in and another leaning very slightly back. Prince Alexander found her within 20 minutes. He crossed the room without pausing to be seen crossing it, stood beside her, looked out at the gathering rather than at her, and said without preamble that he found such evenings more bearable when there was someone nearby who was watching rather than performing. She said that she supposed that depended on what one was watching for. He said that in his experience, the most interesting things in any room were generally located at its edges. She said she had observed the same. By the time he had stood beside her for 30 minutes, this had been observed and processed by every person in the room with any capacity for social observation, which in a room composed almost entirely of society, people was essentially everyone present, Celestine noticed. Elara watched the noticing move across her face from across the room, the slow, controlled tightening around the eyes, the repositioning of the smile into a shape that retained its form while losing its ease, the way her attention tracked with the focused precision of a navigator who has discovered that her intended route is no longer available and is urgently recalculating alternatives. Elara said nothing of it to the man beside her. He spoke to her instead about the city, about rain, about an embassy garden in the southern quarter containing the finest old roses he had encountered outside his own country's palace grounds, neglected for years but with the bone structure of something that had once been magnificent and had not forgotten its own nature. She said she had read the garden had been poorly kept for some time. He said that neglected things often surprised people when properly attended to. The look he gave her when he said this was direct and specific and entirely deliberate, and she held it without flinching, because she had been standing in one kind of rain or another for years and had learned, with some difficulty and then with great reliability, not to look away from weather. He asked at the end of the evening to call on her. Not on the Whitmore household, on her specifically. Elara Voss, at the small flat in Meredith Street, she maintained on the remnant income of a trust her father had had the foresight to place beyond his creditor's reach. None of the Whitmores had ever visited it, because it contained nothing useful to them and represented nothing they wished to be associated with. She gave him the address with the quiet steadiness of a person who has made a decision somewhere between the third conversation and the walk towards the cloakroom and intends to stand behind it. He came 3 days later, alone, but for one discreet aide who waited on the landing with the practiced invisibility of a man skilled at his particular form of work. He sat in the chair by the window and drank the tea she made with genuine attention, not in the absent way powerful people drink things offered by others, as though the drinking were merely a formality to be discharged. He looked at her bookshelves with a thoroughness she recognized as genuine, because she had spent 3 years watching people examine bookshelves as decoration, and this was entirely otherwise. She told him about the books, not as inventory, but in the way one tells a person about things that matter. He listened with the quality of attention that is the rarest thing one person can offer another, unperformed and unhurried and genuinely interested. She had not been listened to in this way in long enough that she had forgotten it was possible. She kept her expression composed and said what she had to say and noted, with the quiet precision of a woman who observes everything, that his attention was entirely without agenda, that he was listening because what she was saying interested him, which was immediately and unmistakably recognizable as real. She told him about the books, not as inventory, but in the way one tells a person about things that matter, selectively and honestly, beginning with the ones her father had kept, and moving to the ones she had bought herself in years of careful accounting, arranged now by the private system her father had taught her, which organized books not alphabetically or by genre but by the interior logic of which volumes needed to live, beside which others to make full sense of themselves and each other. He listened with the quality of attention that is the rarest thing one person can offer another, unperformed and unhurried and genuinely interested in what it hears. Then he spoke about the library in the east wing of the Valen Palace, which had not been properly catalogued in 40 years. He described it not as a bureaucratic problem awaiting resolution, but with the particular care of a person who values something he has not been able to do right by. The library had been his mother's before she died. He did not say this directly. He said it in the way that grief is sometimes communicated, in the shape of everything surrounding the thing itself rather than in the naming of the thing. She did not ask him to be more explicit. She understood the shape fluently. His eyes were, at close range and in the grey afternoon light from the flat's single east-facing window, more complicated than grey. There were darker currents in them, the specific depth of someone who has spent a considerable time looking at difficult things and has not found a way to stop seeing them once seen. She asked about the library instead, and listened to him describe it the way one describes a loss, not the fact of losing, but the precise texture of the lost thing. The shelves of uncatalogued volumes still in the partial order his mother had been working toward before the order of her days was interrupted, and then ended. The reading chairs still angled toward the windows she had preferred. The whole room suspended in something not quite mourning, but close to it, preserved and unattended and waiting in the dark of a closed east wing for someone with the patience and the genuine care to open the door and begin. She understood this grief with a fluency that came from practice. She did not say so. But he watched her while he spoke, and seemed, in some quiet way she could not have articulated, to understand that she did. The weeks that followed existed in 2 distinct registers, private and public, and the gap between them widened as the weeks did. In private, in the sitting room in Meredith Street, in a walk through the neglected embassy garden where the roses proved exactly as poor as predicted, and he acknowledged this with a grimness that contained something close to tenderness for the ruined thing, in one long, unhurried afternoon at the Landau Institute, where they read in the same silence without either of them feeling it as something requiring repair. Something was being built between them with more attention than ceremony, and without the noise that accompanies things constructed for an audience. In public, the Whitmore household had recalibrated entirely. Mrs. Whitmore called at Meredith Street twice in a week. Damien had been steered toward a formal dissolution of the engagement, the stated grounds being that Elara had conducted herself in a manner inconsistent with her position. a remarkable formulation from a family that had stationed her on rain-wet steps to manage their luggage. She accepted the dissolution without drama and signed the document without contempt. She returned the ring in a plain envelope with a card that said only, "Thank you. This is better for us both." She believed it completely. She told Prince Alexander none of this until he asked directly the following week. When she had finished, he said, in a very controlled tone, that he was glad the matter had resolved before he found it necessary to involve himself. This told her precisely what he had been prepared to do if it had not. The almost smile appeared then, quieter and warmer than any version she had seen, and she felt it the way one feels the shift in a room's temperature, not dramatically, but with complete certainty. She had learned, watching the weeks unfold in their two registers, that the private self and the public self are sustained by entirely different materials, the private by attention and genuine moments, the public by the management of what is visible. She had for 3 years invested almost entirely in the public self, in the careful labor of being a composed and undemanding presence in rooms that did not particularly want her. She was finding that the private self had been waiting with considerable patience and was now beginning to make its preferences known. What Celestine Whitmore did next was not, in retrospect, a surprise. She was a woman who had been affirmed by every mirror and every drawing room and every devoted orbit of admirers that she was the natural and inevitable object of any significant man's attention, and the revision of this understanding was not something she had been equipped, by temperament or by 30 years of contrary evidence, to undertake with grace. She went to the press, not directly, which would have been crude and attributable, but through that elegant chain of indirection the socially malicious have long preferred, a confidence shared with a trusted friend, relayed to a contact, delivered to a correspondent, surfacing finally as a paragraph in a society column, phrased as concerned inquiry, as though the author were performing a public service by raising questions decent people deserved answered. The questions concerned the background of a certain Miss Voss, her late father's history in business and in the courts, the unresolved nature of certain professional associations that had left various parties in difficult positions, and whether a man of the Crown Prince's standing had been made adequately aware of what he had chosen to associate himself with. The paragraph was careful and deniable. It stated nothing that was not already in the public record, but was designed to introduce a specific and lingering quality of doubt into a situation Celestine needed disrupted. The faint smell of uncertainty where there had been clarity. Elara read it on a Thursday morning at the table by the window. She read it twice, with the careful attention she gave to things deliberately constructed to affect her. Then she put the paper down. She made another cup of tea. She had spent several years, since the first time her father's name appeared in newsprint alongside the word failure, learning that ink dried, and that the critical question was never whether difficult things were written about you, but what you did in the days after the ink dried, who you chose to be in the space that drying left. She was not ashamed of her father. He had made errors of judgment and had paid for them entirely, and she had paid alongside him without disowning him, and there was nothing in the column invisible to anyone willing to look. And Prince Alexander, she understood by now with certainty, was always willing to look. She had not hidden anything from him. She wrote him a short, plain note, informing him that he would likely encounter a certain column, and that she wished him to know, before he did, that she was not concerned by it, and trusted him to make of it what he would. His reply arrived that same afternoon and said only, "I have already read it. It has not changed anything. Come to the Palace Gardens Thursday if the weather holds." On Thursday she went. The gardens were in the state she had anticipated, the roses in poor condition, the beds half cleared by someone who had begun and abandoned the work, the paths navigable but only just. He was already there when she arrived, standing at the far end of the longest path, looking at a rose that had managed to produce, despite everything, one late and defiant bloom, the color of dark honey. He said without turning, "It held." She came to stand beside him and looked at the rose. "It did," she said. They stood for a moment in the quiet that had become, by now, one of the established languages between them. Then she said that, with the right attention through the winter, it might be something remarkable by the following summer. He said he had been thinking the same thing for several years and had not known who to ask to begin. She said she could begin now, if he liked. He said he would like that very much. They spent the next hour in the garden, discussing root systems and drainage and the particular stubbornness of old roses that have been left long enough to develop real character. It was, she thought later, one of the most honest afternoons she had spent in years. She had lived for so long in careful containment, the practiced art of requiring nothing visibly, that she had not noticed how much weight that containment carried until she began, incrementally and without ceremony, to set some of it down. It happened in the sitting room in Meredith Street, with a man who was asking real questions and listening to real answers. It happened in the garden, kneeling in the damp, talking about roots. It happened in the library when the light went golden and they were both reading, and neither of them felt the need to say anything at all. She was, she realized, being known. She had not known how hungry she was for it until it began. The occasion on which the matter resolved itself publicly was a charity concert at the old municipal hall, a formal evening whose attendance was expected by the accumulated social obligations of the autumn season, and precisely the kind of occasion at which Celestine Whitmore had always appeared to greatest and most deliberate effect. She was, that evening, formidable. The gown was deep crimson and cut with the particular self-awareness of a garment that knows exactly what it is doing, and the jewels at her throat had been chosen to catch the chandelier light in a way that left as little to chance as could be arranged. She had arrived early and positioned herself at the room's centre with the ease of long practice, and was surrounded by the time the Crown Prince's party entered by exactly the right constellation of attractive and well-connected people to project effortless centrality. Alara arrived separately and alone in the deep green silk she had bought at a small sale 3 months prior. The green was not the colour she usually chose. She moved habitually in greys and lavenders, the colours of someone who has decided not to contest rooms. But this was a green that lived between forest and deep shadow, serious enough to be quiet and warm enough to be alive. And she wore it without apology because she had decided, over the preceding weeks, to stop organizing her appearance as though her presence in rooms required prior justification. She found a seat in the 3rd row from the back. She watched the room with the attention of a woman who has learned that rooms tell you a great deal if you allow them to. She watched Celestine navigate the space with the ease of a woman for whom social movement is the medium of existence. She watched Prince Alexander enter, discharge the required greetings with polite brevity, and then do what she had observed him do in every room she had seen him enter, scan it thoroughly and without haste, reading what was actually present. His gaze travelled past the crimson gown and the jewels, past the cluster of luminous women arranged toward the best light, past the dignitaries and the decorated and the conspicuously positioned. It moved with the quiet inevitability of water finding the lowest point in any landscape, toward the 3rd row from the back, where a woman in forest green was sitting alone and making no effort to be found. He excused himself from the people around him and crossed the room. Not urgently, not as performance, simply with the direct certainty of a man who had decided where he was going and saw no sensible reason to take an indirect route. He sat down beside her. In full view of every observant eye in the hall, he sat down beside her and said, in a voice pitched to carry just far enough, "Miss Voss, I find I have been meaning to say something to you, and I have concluded that the right occasion is simply when the thing needs to be said. Will you permit me?" She looked at him. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. "Yes," she said. And he said, I did not come to find you because you were convenient or available. I sought you out because in a room full of extraordinary display, you were the only person watching the room itself, and I have spent a very long time being the only one doing that, and I find I am no longer willing to. I chose you. I am choosing you now. I intend to go on choosing you, with your permission, for considerably longer than this evening. The hall had acquired the quality of a room in which every person is making a determined effort to appear occupied with something other than what they are actually doing, which was listening. Celestine Whitmore stood 12 feet away. Elara did not look at her. She felt the specific quality of that stillness across the space between them and chose not to examine it, because whatever combination of humiliation and the particular agony of watching a long expectation collapse in public lived in that stillness was not her wound to tend. She looked instead at the man beside her, at the winter-grey eyes that were cold only at the surface, the way old stone buildings are cold to the touch while warm within. And she said, "I believe I would like that very much." The matter of the column resolved itself within a fortnight, when the young man who had provided the original account was found to have obligations held by a firm that Prince Alexander's household had occasion to review. He found that candour was preferable to its alternative. Celestine left for her aunt's estate the following month. Elara did not see her go. 1 year later, the palace at Vallen had a rose garden that had become a subject of admiring mention among those who visited. It had technically always had a rose garden, but the garden that existed now was an entirely different thing from its formal, geometric predecessor. This one had been cleared of years of accumulated dead growth, and then given support where needed, and latitude where the plant itself could manage, so that the roses which came up in the second spring were the kind that had found their own shapes and expressed them without inhibition, climbing where inclination led, spreading where the soil invited, producing in high summer a disorder of colour and fragrance that the head gardener called the finest thing in his professional experience, and that the housekeeper cut from each morning to fill the rooms of both wings with something living and uncontrolled and entirely itself. In the east wing, the library had been catalogued over 4 months of morning work, using the system her father had taught her in the Wexham house when she was 12. Organized not alphabetically or by genre, but by the private logic of which books belonged, beside which others to make full sense of themselves and each other. The senior archivist, a man of 30 years in the profession, and a deep native skepticism about outside interference, had examined the completed catalogue with the attention of someone who expects to find fault, and has encountered instead something that removes that expectation. He told her it was the most rational arrangement he had encountered in his career. She thanked him and asked what still needed doing. The dining table in the family apartments was small and round. The previous one had been long, the kind of long that is a statement about importance, that places 2 people at the formal distance of opposite ends and calls this a dinner. She had asked, in her 2nd month, whether it might be exchanged for something more sensible. The staff brought in the round table without comment, and nobody mentioned it afterward. But the housekeeper, Mrs. Draven, who had been the most watchfully resistant of all the staff in those early months, a woman of 22 years' service, who had developed accordingly a deep and earned conservatism about trusting new arrangements, had left a small cut-glass vase of roses from the garden on the breakfast table within the following week. She did not mention it. It was simply there, changed when the previous roses passed their best, never referred to directly by either of them. A signal in a private language being built word by careful word between 2 women who had both learned, by long practice, to communicate in ways that require no audience and no acknowledgement. On the morning of their first anniversary, he brought her tea himself. He set the cup on the table by the window where she sat looking out at the rose garden in the early grey light, and he said, without preface, "You have made this place a home." She looked up at him for a long moment. This man who was, underneath the crown and everything it required him to carry, simply a person who had wanted very badly to be known by someone paying honest attention, and who had not found that person until he stopped a motorcade in the rain and looked directly at the woman on the servants' steps instead of past her. Then, for the first time in a period longer than she could trace the thread of back through the careful years, she let herself cry. Not from sorrow, not from cold or humiliation or the grinding discipline of years spent holding herself intact by refusing others the satisfaction of her undoing. She cried because she had arrived, completely and without reservation, at a place where it was safe to. He did not speak. He sat beside her and put his hand over hers on the table, and they remained together in the early light, in the warm room, surrounded by books and the scent of the garden, and the long, undemanding silence of two people who had found in each other the one place in the world where neither of them was required to perform anything at all. She had not been chosen as an act of charity, or elevated as a mercy, or selected because she was available when the convenient alternative was not. He had been paying attention, simply and honestly and without agenda, at a moment when no one else was. He had been paying attention in every room and at every edge, and in every rain he had ever stood in, until he found what he had been looking for on the servants' steps of a house that did not deserve her, with her collar turned up, and her eyes meeting his without apology or performance, or any pretense of being something other than entirely, irreplaceably herself. He was not lucky to have found her. He was simply a man who had never stopped looking. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.